The piano's final note hung in the empty restaurant like a prayer. Carter Hayes stepped away from the keys, his waiter's uniform wrinkled from a 12-hour shift. His calloused hand extended toward the woman who had been sitting alone in the shadows for months. Isabel's fingers trembled as she reached back, the burn scars on her left cheek catching the dim light like silver tears. The classical melody began again, this time from the sound system, as their bodies moved together in perfect, desperate harmony. Through the restaurant's front window, expensive headlights cut through the darkness. Footsteps echoed on marble steps. Terror flashed across her scarred face as she recognized the familiar stride. Her father's pride had always been his weakness. Tonight, this song would become his breaking point. What happened when the CEO discovered his daughter in the arms of a mere waiter? 3 months earlier, Carter Hayes had no idea that serving table 14 would change everything. The Golden Crown restaurant buzzed with Chicago's elite that Friday evening, crystal glasses chiming against imported china, while conversations flowed in hushed, expensive tones. Carter moved between the tables with practiced efficiency, his white shirt pressed crisp despite the heat from the kitchen. At 36, he had learned to make himself invisible among the wealthy, just another pair of hands delivering their perfectly plated dreams. His daughter Lily waited at home with Mrs. Patterson from next door, probably working on her math homework at their small kitchen table. The woman at table 14 arrived precisely at 8:30, always requesting the corner booth furthest from the main dining area. She wore expensive clothes but carried herself like someone trying to disappear. Carter noticed how she positioned herself so the left side of her face remained in shadow, how she ordered the same meal every time: grilled salmon, no sauce, steamed vegetables. Her voice was soft, cultured, with the kind of refinement that spoke of private schools and summers in the Hamptons. She tipped generously, but never made eye contact, her fingers always fidgeting with the silk scarf around her neck. Carter had developed an eye for reading people during his 3 years at the Golden Crown, the investment bankers who barked orders to hide their insecurities, the society wives who sent back perfectly good wine because they could. But this woman was different. She carried pain like a weight, visible in the careful way she moved her head, the deliberate positioning of her purse to create another barrier between herself and the world. Something about her reminded him of Lily after nightmares, that same fragile strength trying to hold itself together. He found himself checking on her table more often than necessary, refilling her water glass before it emptied. On her 4th visit, she spoke beyond the usual pleasantries. Carter was clearing her barely touched dessert when she noticed his hands, the calluses on his fingertips that no amount of restaurant work could create. Musicians' marks, earned from years of daily practice. She asked if he played, and something in her tone made him pause in his efficient clearing routine. He mentioned piano, classical training at Northwestern before life took different turns. Her eyes brightened for just a moment before the shadows returned. She mentioned loving music once, before catching herself and requesting the check. But the conversation had cracked something open between them. The following week brought an unexpected snowstorm that left the restaurant nearly empty. Only 3 tables occupied, the rest of Chicago apparently deciding to stay home rather than brave the icy streets. Carter found himself with unusual downtime, his usual rush reduced to a gentle rhythm. The woman, she had finally introduced herself as Izzy, sat in her corner booth, but tonight she seemed different. More fragile somehow, like glass that had been struck but hadn't yet shattered. When he brought her coffee, she asked about the piano in the main dining room. Did anyone ever play it? The question hung between them like an invitation neither quite knew how to accept. Carter glanced around the nearly empty restaurant, then made a decision that would have seemed impossible weeks earlier. He told her he sometimes played after closing, when the kitchen staff finished cleaning and the last customers departed. The words tumbled out before he could stop them. an invitation wrapped in casual information. She could stay late sometime, if she wanted to hear something other than the ambient jazz that played through the sound system. Her smile was the first genuine expression he had seen from her, transforming her careful composure into something achingly beautiful. Even with half her face carefully angled away from the light, she was luminous. The next Friday, Izzy lingered after her meal while Carter finished his closing duties. The last customer departed around 10, leaving them alone except for Miguel finishing dishes in the kitchen. Carter approached the baby grand piano that served as decoration more than instrument, its black surface reflecting the dimmed chandeliers above. His fingers found the keys tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as muscle memory took over. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major filled the space, each note carrying 3 years of suppressed longing for the music that had once defined his life. Izzy moved closer, drawn by the melody that seemed to understand her own hidden sorrows. When the piece ended, silence stretched between them like a question mark. Izzy spoke softly about dancing, how music had once moved through her body, like blood through veins. She had been a professional, performing with small companies throughout the Midwest before everything changed. Carter heard the past tense, recognized the grief that accompanied dreams deferred. They talked until Miguel finished cleaning, their conversation weaving around shared losses and the strange comfort of finding someone who understood that some doors, once closed, felt impossible to reopen. When she finally left that night, Carter realized he had been holding his breath for weeks. The late-night piano sessions became their secret ritual. Every Friday after closing, Izzy would wait while Carter finished his duties, then they would spend an hour in the empty restaurant with only music for company. She began requesting specific pieces: Debussy's Clair de Lune, Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. Carter's fingers remembered more than he expected, years of training emerging from beneath the calluses of restaurant work. Izzy would sit on the small sofa near the piano, her face relaxed in the dim lighting, occasionally humming along with melodies that seemed to unlock memories she thought she had buried. These moments felt stolen from reality, existing in a space between their daytime selves and something more honest. One evening in November, Carter brought Lily to the restaurant after her school's parent conference. 8 years old with her mother's dark eyes and Carter's stubborn chin, Lily had inherited the Hayes family's musical ear, along with an insatiable curiosity about people. She spotted Izzy immediately, approached with the fearless directness that only children possess. Izzy's carefully maintained barriers crumbled under Lily's innocent questions about her pretty scarf, and whether she liked piano music too. For 20 minutes, Carter watched his daughter and this mysterious woman discuss everything from favorite colors to whether mermaids could play underwater pianos. Izzy's laughter, when it finally emerged, was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. That night, after Lily fell asleep, Carter lay awake thinking about connections, how his daughter had accomplished in 20 minutes what he had been carefully building for weeks. Izzy had looked different in Lily's presence, younger, less guarded, as if remembering a version of herself that existed before whatever had driven her into shadows. She had hugged Lily goodbye, a spontaneous gesture that surprised them all. Carter realized he was falling for someone whose last name he didn't even know, whose life remained a carefully guarded mystery. The recognition should have frightened him, but instead it felt like waking up after a long, dreamless sleep. December arrived with unusual warmth, Chicago's winter delayed by some meteorological grace. Carter had been working double shifts to cover Christmas expenses, his body running on coffee and determination. The restaurant stayed busy with holiday parties and year-end corporate celebrations. Izzy's Friday visits became the anchor point of his week, the moment when exhaustion transformed into anticipation. She had begun staying later, sometimes until nearly midnight, their conversations growing deeper as the city quieted around them. She spoke carefully about her past, mentions of traveling, of performing, of a father whose expectations cast long shadows over her choices. One Friday night in mid-December, Izzy arrived looking different. Her usual carefully arranged scarf was missing, and for the first time, Carter saw the full extent of the burn scars that decorated the left side of her face. The damage was severe, but somehow made her more beautiful, like a marble statue that had survived fire and emerged as something more complex than mere perfection. She noticed his gaze and started to turn away, old instincts reasserting themselves. But Carter reached out gently, his fingertips tracing the air near her cheek without quite touching. The gesture was enough, an acceptance that required no words. She began to cry, 3 months of careful composure finally cracking open. The story emerged slowly, between tears and Carter's patient silences. A house fire 2 years ago, caused by faulty wiring in her dance studio. She had been rehearsing late, alone in the building when the electrical system sparked and caught. The escape route through the main door became blocked by flames, forcing her through a window that shattered on impact. The burns covered her left cheek and neck, ending her dancing career in one terrible night. The physical healing had been manageable compared to the psychological trauma of losing the identity that had defined her for 28 years. She had retreated from public life, from the father whose disappointment felt worse than physical pain, from a world that no longer seemed to have space for her dreams. Carter listened without offering platitudes or false comfort. He understood the grief of losing yourself, had felt it keenly during those first months after Sarah's death, when playing piano felt like betraying her memory. Instead, he shared his own story, the music scholarship to Northwestern, the promising career that ended when Sarah got pregnant with Lily, and they chose love over ambition. The car accident 3 years ago that took Sarah, but left him with their daughter, and a lifetime of what-ifs. How playing at the Golden Crown was both penance and healing, a way of staying connected to music without the pressure of performance. Their pain was different, but somehow compatible, like 2 instruments finding harmony in a minor key. That night, for the first time, Izzy asked if she could try dancing while he played. The request was whispered, tentative, as if saying it too loudly might break the spell they had been weaving for months. Carter chose Moonlight Sonata, its familiar melody providing safe harbor for whatever vulnerability she was offering. Izzy stood slowly, testing her body's relationship with music after 2 years of silence. Her movements were cautious at first, then gradually more confident as the piano's voice reminded her muscles of their former eloquence. The scars didn't diminish her grace. They transformed it into something more profound than technical perfection could ever achieve. The dance lasted only minutes, but something fundamental shifted between them. Izzy's tears came again, but these were different. Grief mixed with relief, the sound of something long frozen beginning to thaw. Carter continued playing even after she stopped moving, letting the music fill the spaces where words would have been inadequate. When he finally lifted his hands from the keys, they sat in comfortable silence while the city hummed its late-night song outside the restaurant's tall windows. Izzy whispered that she hadn't felt like herself in 2 years, but tonight, for just a few minutes, she had remembered who she used to be. Carter understood exactly what she meant. Christmas week brought a strange energy to the Golden Crown. Corporate parties every night, champagne flowing like water, the city's powerful celebrating another year of accumulated wealth and influence. Carter worked mechanically through the festivities, his mind focused on Friday night's promise of music, and whatever evolution his relationship with Izzy might take next. He had begun looking forward to her visits with an intensity that surprised him, had started choosing pieces specifically for her, imagining how the melodies might move through her body in dance. Lily had been asking about the pretty lady with the scarf, wanting to know when she might visit again. Carter found himself hoping the answer might be soon. Friday arrived with an unexpected development. Izzy came to the restaurant earlier than usual, around 7:30, and sat at her customary table while Carter finished serving the evening's last customers. But something was different in her demeanor, a nervous energy that kept her hands moving, adjusting her purse, smoothing her hair, checking her phone. When Carter approached with her usual order, she declined food entirely, asking only for coffee and whether they might start their musical evening earlier than usual. The request felt charged with significance, though Carter couldn't identify exactly what had changed. He agreed, curiosity overriding his usual caution about maintaining professional boundaries during business hours. By 9:30, the restaurant had emptied, except for kitchen staff finishing their closing routines. Carter dimmed the main lights, creating the intimate atmosphere that had become their Friday night tradition. But when he sat at the piano, Izzy made an unusual request. Instead of choosing a specific piece, she asked him to play whatever felt right in the moment, something from his heart rather than her preferences. The instruction felt like removing safety rails from a high bridge, terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Carter's hands found Moonlight Sonata again, but this time he played it differently, adding variations and personal touches that made the familiar melody uniquely his own interpretation. Izzy stood during the opening measures, her movement more confident than the tentative exploration of the previous week. This time, she removed her scarf entirely, letting her hair fall naturally around her face without attempting to hide the scars. Her dance was a conversation with the piano, each phrase of music answered by corresponding gestures, her body remembering years of training while adapting to its new reality. Carter found himself playing not just the notes on the page, but responding to her movements, creating a musical dialogue that felt improvised and inevitable simultaneously. They were making something together that neither could have created alone. The piece built toward its natural climax, piano and dancer pushing each other toward greater emotional heights. Izzy's movements became more expansive, her former professional training evident in every line and gesture. The scars on her face caught the light as she turned, but instead of hiding them, she seemed to be celebrating her survival, transforming her wounds into part of her art. Carter's playing grew more passionate, his usual restraint dissolving under the influence of her courage. For 10 perfect minutes, they existed in a bubble of music and movement that felt separated from the ordinary world by something approaching magic. Then the front door opened with a crash that shattered their private universe like a stone through stained glass. Harrison Rothschild stood silhouetted in the entrance, his expensive coat dripping with melted snow, his face twisted with a mixture of shock and rage that Carter recognized immediately as paternal fury. Izzy froze mid-movement, the music stopping abruptly as Carter's hands lifted from the keys like they had been burned. The silence that followed felt violent, charged with the electricity of worlds colliding. Harrison's voice, when he finally spoke, carried the authority of someone unaccustomed to being defied. "Isabel Marie Rothschild, what in God's name do you think you're doing?" The full name hit Carter like physical impact. Rothschild Industries, one of Chicago's most powerful development companies, the kind of wealth that bought politicians and shaped city skylines. Harrison Rothschild, whose face graced Forbes covers and whose opinions moved markets. And Isabel, was his daughter, the heiress who had disappeared from society pages 2 years ago, whose absence had been explained by vague references to personal challenges and focusing on family. Carter felt the ground shifting beneath him as he realized the magnitude of what he had unknowingly stumbled into. The mysterious woman he had been falling for was Chicago royalty, and he was just a waiter with calloused hands and a uniform that smelled like kitchen grease. Harrison's gaze moved from his daughter to Carter with the slow, calculated assessment of a predator identifying prey. His eyes took in the piano, the dimmed lights, the intimate setting that had been crafted for reasons he was only beginning to understand. When he spoke again, his voice carried decades of practiced authority. "And you are?" The question wasn't really asking for information. It was a demand for explanation, justification, some reasonable account of why his damaged daughter was dancing in an empty restaurant with someone so clearly beneath their social station. Carter felt his throat close, words deserting him under the weight of Harrison's scrutiny. Izzy found her voice first, stepping slightly forward as if to shield Carter from her father's attention. Her words came out in a rush, defensive and explanatory all at once. She talked about music therapy, about finding healing through artistic expression, about Carter being a trained musician who understood the therapeutic value of classical performance. Every word was technically true, but missed the emotional reality of what had been developing between them for months. Harrison listened with the patience of someone gathering evidence, his expression growing darker with each attempt at rationalization. Carter could see him cataloging details: the expensive sound system, the intimate lighting, the fact that they were alone together after business hours. The interrogation that followed felt like surgical dismantling. Harrison's questions were precise, designed to expose the relationship's true nature beneath Izzy's careful explanations. How long had these sessions been occurring? Who else knew about them? What exactly was Carter's background, his qualifications, his intentions regarding his daughter? Each inquiry peeled away another layer of the careful world Carter and Izzy had constructed, revealing it to be exactly what Harrison suspected: an inappropriate relationship between a working-class man and a woman whose trust fund could buy the restaurant they were standing in. Carter answered when directly addressed, but felt increasingly like a defendant in a trial where the verdict had been predetermined. Harrison's fury, when it finally erupted, was surgical in its precision. He didn't shout or lose control. Instead, he delivered his judgment with the calm certainty of someone whose word carried legal weight. Carter would be terminated immediately, his employment at the Golden Crown ending that night. Furthermore, Harrison would ensure that he never worked in Chicago's hospitality industry again, his name blacklisted among the network of establishments that catered to the city's elite. The threats weren't delivered with emotion, but with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing inevitable weather. This was simply how things worked when people forgot their place in the social order. But the personal attack cut deeper than professional consequences. Harrison turned his attention to Carter's fitness as a parent, questioning whether someone who would seduce vulnerable women could be trusted with a child's welfare. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas, transforming Carter's protective love for Lily into evidence of moral failure. Harrison's investigators could easily discover details about Carter's financial struggles, his reliance on neighbors for childcare, the apartment in a neighborhood that Chicago's wealthy avoided. A concerned citizen report to Child Protective Services, filed by someone of Harrison's standing, would trigger investigations that could tear apart the only family Carter had left. Izzy's breakdown was devastating to witness. She collapsed under the weight of her father's disapproval, years of conditioning reasserting themselves in the face of his absolute authority. Her apologies came between sobs. She was sorry for embarrassing him, sorry for making poor choices, sorry for believing she could have something approaching normal human connection. She promised to return home immediately, to resume the medical treatments he had been recommending, to withdraw from any activities that might bring further shame to their family name. Each capitulation felt like watching someone die by degrees, the confident woman who had been dancing minutes earlier, dissolving into the traumatized victim her father apparently preferred. Carter's response surprised even himself. Instead of backing down under Harrison's threats, he stepped forward, placing himself between father and daughter, with a protective instinct that overrode self-preservation. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the quiet strength of someone who had nothing left to lose. He told Harrison exactly what he thought of a man who would weaponize his daughter's trauma, who would destroy her first moments of healing because they didn't fit his image of appropriate behavior. The words came from a place of pure anger. 3 years of suppressed grief and frustration over his own powerlessness, finally finding a target worthy of his rage. The confrontation escalated quickly after that. Harrison, unaccustomed to being challenged by anyone, let alone someone he considered hired help, responded with escalating threats about lawsuits, restraining orders, criminal charges for whatever violations of trust or professional conduct he could manufacture. Carter matched him word for word, his protection of Izzy transforming into something fierce and uncompromising. He had spent years learning to make himself invisible among the wealthy. But tonight, that protective coloring was stripped away, leaving only a father's instinct to shield someone vulnerable from predatory power. The argument drew Miguel from the kitchen, then other staff members, turning their private disaster into a public spectacle. Security cameras captured everything. Harrison's entitled rage, Carter's defiant protection of Izzy, her breakdown in the center of it all. The footage would later circulate among Chicago's service industry workers, becoming a rallying cry for everyone who had ever been humiliated by customers who confused wealth with worth. But in the moment, Carter only cared about Izzy, who stood frozen between two men whose conflict was destroying whatever fragile progress she had made toward healing. Her father's threats and Carter's defiance were both expressions of protective love, but the collision between them was obliterating the very person they claimed to care about. The evening ended with police intervention, called by Harrison when Carter refused to leave the premises voluntarily. The officers, recognizing one of Chicago's most powerful citizens, approached the situation with appropriate deference to wealth and status. Carter was escorted from the building without arrest, but with clear understanding that returning would result in criminal charges. Izzy left with her father, her face once again hidden behind scarves and shadows, her brief emergence into sunlight apparently over before it had truly begun. The Golden Crown returned to its usual elegant calm, as if the previous hour had been a fever dream that left no lasting traces except in the memories of those who witnessed it. The aftermath unfolded exactly as Harrison had promised. Carter's termination was swift and comprehensive, his final paycheck delivered with a non-disclosure agreement that carried severe financial penalties for any public discussion of his employment or the circumstances of his departure. The blacklisting was subtler, but equally effective. No restaurants in the downtown corridor would consider his applications, his references mysteriously becoming unavailable when prospective employers called. Within 2 weeks, Carter found himself delivering food for a chain restaurant in the suburbs, his income reduced by more than half, and his professional reputation destroyed by whispered warnings about inappropriate conduct that he had no way to refute. The investigation of his parenting came next, exactly as threatened. A social worker arrived at his apartment on a Wednesday morning, armed with anonymous complaints about his judgment and living situation. The inspection was thorough and intrusive. Financial records examined, neighbors interviewed. Lily questioned privately about her father's behavior and care. Carter endured it all with grinding determination, understanding that any sign of anger or resentment would be interpreted as evidence supporting Harrison's accusations. The caseworker eventually concluded that Lily was well cared for and happy, but the file remained open, a sword hanging over their small family that could fall at any time. Lily, sensing her father's distress without understanding its cause, began having nightmares again for the first time since the first year after her mother's death. She asked repeatedly about the pretty lady with the scarf, wanting to know why she didn't visit anymore, whether she was okay, if Daddy had done something wrong. Carter's attempts to explain were inadequate. How do you tell an 8-year-old that some people are too important to be friends with people like them? that love isn't always enough to overcome the barriers that society builds between different kinds of lives. Lily's innocent questions were the cruelest punishment of all, highlighting exactly what Carter had lost when Harrison's world collided with his own. Meanwhile, Izzy disappeared completely from public view. Her few social media accounts went dark. Her friends received no responses to concerned messages. Even the society reporters who had once tracked her every appearance found no trace of Harrison Rothschild's damaged daughter. Carter found himself scanning news stories for mentions of the family, hoping for some sign that she was okay, that their brief connection had meant something to her beyond a moment of rebellion against paternal control. But Chicago's wealthy guard their private scandals carefully, and whatever was happening in the Rothschild mansion remained completely hidden from the working world that Carter inhabited. Depression settled over Carter like a familiar coat, similar to the grief that had followed Sarah's death, but somehow more bitter. Losing Sarah had been tragic, but comprehensible. Death was part of life's natural order, however cruel its timing. But losing Izzy felt like being punished for hope itself, for believing that connection could transcend circumstances, that love might be stronger than social expectations. He found himself unable to play piano at all, his fingers feeling clumsy and foreign on the keys. The music that had sustained him through years of grief now reminded him only of what he had briefly possessed, and foolishly thought he might keep. Christmas came and went with mechanical precision. Carter managed to provide Lily with gifts and traditions, but his heart wasn't present for the celebration. She noticed his distraction, asked repeatedly if he was sick or sad, if there was something she could do to help him feel better. Her concern only deepened his guilt. How many times would he put his daughter through watching him fall apart? First after losing her mother, now after losing someone who was never really his to begin with. The pattern felt unsustainable, his personal disasters increasingly affecting the one person who depended on him completely. January brought Chicago's usual brutal cold and the grinding routine of rebuilding a life from scattered pieces. Carter worked double shifts at the suburban restaurant, saving money and trying to prove that he could provide stability despite the chaos of recent months. He found a therapist who specialized in grief counseling, someone who could help him process not just the loss of Izzy, but the deeper issues of worthlessness and social powerlessness that Harrison's attack had exposed. Slowly, painfully, he began to understand that his relationship with Izzy had meant more than romantic love. It had been proof that he was worth knowing, that his value as a person extended beyond his utility to others. The breakthrough came on a Friday night in late January, almost exactly 2 months after the confrontation. Carter was walking home from his evening shift when he passed a small music store that stayed open late for weekend customers. In the window, illuminated by warm light, sat a restored upright piano with a "for sale" sign that listed a price just within reach if he used his carefully hoarded emergency fund. He stood on the sidewalk for 20 minutes, snow accumulating on his shoulders, staring at the instrument and remembering everything music had once meant to him. When he finally entered the store, it felt like coming home after a long exile. Buying the piano required sacrifices, cheaper groceries, no eating out, walking instead of taking buses whenever possible. But when it was delivered to their apartment the following week, Lily's joy made every penny worth the cost. She had inherited Carter's musical ear, along with her mother's stubborn optimism, and her delight in having music back in their home was infectious. Carter began teaching her simple pieces, rediscovering his love for piano through her fresh enthusiasm. Playing became healing again instead of remembrance, a bridge toward future possibilities rather than an anchor to painful past. Spring arrived early that year, Chicago's winter releasing its grip in mid-March to reveal a city hungry for warmth and renewal. Carter had been promoted to assistant manager at the suburban restaurant, his work ethic and reliability earning recognition despite his damaged reputation downtown. The investigation of his parenting had been officially closed. Lily's obvious happiness and health-making continued scrutiny impossible to justify. Slowly, carefully, they were rebuilding their lives in a new configuration that acknowledged loss while refusing to be defined by it. Carter even began dating occasionally, nothing serious, but proof that he was capable of human connection beyond the memories that had sustained him through the winter. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon in early April, while Carter was reviewing inventory schedules and Lily was at school. The voice was unfamiliar, but professional, a lawyer representing what he called interested parties in a matter of mutual concern. The language was careful, legally precise, but the message was clear. Someone wanted to meet with Carter to discuss events from the previous December. The location suggested a coffee shop in Lincoln Park, neutral territory away from both their worlds, indicated that this was not another legal threat, but something more complex. Carter agreed to the meeting despite his better judgment, curiosity overriding the caution that months of rebuilding had taught him. The coffee shop was crowded with the usual mixture of students, freelancers, and people conducting business that required privacy without secrecy. Carter arrived early, choosing a table near the window where he could watch for whoever was coming to meet him. When Izzy walked through the door, his heart stopped for several beats before resuming at double speed. She looked different, thinner, her hair shorter, but with something in her bearing that hadn't been there before. The scarf was gone, her scars visible in the afternoon sunlight, and she moved with purpose rather than the careful defensiveness he remembered. When she spotted him, her smile was tentative but genuine, the first real warmth he had seen from her since that last Friday night. The conversation that followed was careful, circling around the devastation of their last meeting while trying to find safe ground for reconnection. Izzy explained that she had spent the winter in therapy, working through not just the trauma of her accident, but the deeper patterns of control and dependence that had shaped her relationship with her father. The confrontation at the Golden Crown had been a catalyst, forcing her to choose between the safety of continued victimhood and the risk of claiming her own life. It had taken months, but she was finally ready to make choices based on her own desires rather than her father's expectations or her own fears. She had moved out of the family mansion, taking an apartment in the city where she could rebuild her identity away from Harrison's influence. The decision had cost her financially. Her trust fund was now controlled by lawyers who answered to her father, but she was working as a movement therapist at a rehabilitation center, helping other people recover from trauma through dance and physical expression. The work was meaningful in ways that her previous life of privilege and performance had never been, giving her a sense of purpose that didn't depend on other people's approval or applause. For the first time since her accident, she felt like she was contributing something valuable to the world. The question of whether they could have any kind of relationship remained unspoken, but present in every exchange. Too much had happened. Too much damage had been done to simply resume where they had left off. But something remained between them, the memory of music and movement, of understanding that transcended their different backgrounds, of connection that had been real, even if it had been unsustainable. Izzy asked about Lily, about Carter's work, about whether he was still playing piano. Her questions carried the weight of months of wondering, of hoping that the destruction hadn't been complete, that some possibility for future connection might survive the wreckage of their past. Carter told her about the piano he had bought, about teaching Lily, about the slow process of rediscovering music as joy rather than loss. He described the therapy, the promotion, the gradual reconstruction of a life that acknowledged what had happened without being paralyzed by it. He was honest about the depression, the months when getting up each morning had required conscious effort, but also about the growing sense that he was stronger than he had realized, more resilient than circumstances had suggested. The man who had been destroyed by Harrison's attack was being replaced by someone who understood his own worth, regardless of other people's recognition. They talked for 3 hours, the coffee shop emptying and refilling around them as afternoon turned to evening. When they finally prepared to leave, the question of what came next hung between them like a bridge half built. Izzy mentioned a recital she was organizing at the Rehabilitation Center, a showcase for clients who had rediscovered artistic expression through their recovery process. She would be dancing, her first public performance since the accident, and she wondered if Carter might consider playing piano for the event. Not as a romantic gesture, but as a statement about the power of art to heal, about the possibility of transforming trauma into something beautiful and meaningful. Carter agreed without hesitation, understanding that this was about more than their personal relationship. The recital represented everything they had been working toward separately: the courage to be vulnerable in public, the transformation of private healing into shared inspiration, the possibility that their individual recoveries might create something larger than the sum of their separate struggles. They exchanged phone numbers, made tentative plans for rehearsals, agreed to take things slowly while exploring whether friendship might grow into something deeper. It wasn't the dramatic reunion that movies promised, but it felt real in ways that their previous intensity had not. The recital took place on a warm evening in late May in the community center attached to the rehabilitation facility where Izzy worked. The audience was small: patients and their families, staff members, a few volunteers and donors who supported the program. Carter had practiced for weeks, choosing pieces that would complement rather than overshadow Izzy's dancing, music that would support her story without demanding attention for itself. When he sat at the modest, upright piano and began the opening measures of a piece they had arranged together, his hands were steady and his heart was calm. Izzy's performance was a revelation. She had choreographed a piece that incorporated her scars and limitations rather than hiding them, movements that turned her trauma into part of her artistic vocabulary. The dance told the story of destruction and rebuilding, of learning to find beauty in imperfection, of discovering that survival itself could be a form of grace. When she moved into the final sequence, tears streaming down her face, but her body strong and certain, the audience rose to their feet in recognition of something far more important than technical perfection. After the applause died down and the audience began to disperse, Carter and Izzy found themselves alone at the piano. The evening had been everything they had hoped: a celebration of recovery, a demonstration that art could transform suffering into something meaningful and shared. But more than that, it had been proof that they could create something together that honored their individual journeys while pointing toward possibilities they had never imagined. When Izzy asked if he would like to have dinner the following week, just the two of them, Carter said yes, with the same quiet certainty that had carried him through months of rebuilding. 6 months later, on a crisp October evening, Carter and Izzy were married in the same community center where they had performed together. The ceremony was small: Lily as flower girl, Mrs. Patterson from next door, colleagues from both their workplaces, clients from the rehabilitation center who had become extended family. Harrison Rothschild was not invited and did not attend, his absence noted but not mourned by anyone present. The music was provided by Carter at the piano and Izzy dancing down the aisle, their wedding becoming another performance of the love that had survived destruction to become something stronger and more flexible than what they had originally thought they wanted. The vows they exchanged were simple and honest, acknowledging that they had found each other not in spite of their scars, but because of them. They promised to build a life together that honored their individual recoveries while creating space for shared dreams. Lily, now 9 and fiercely protective of her new stepmother, insisted on adding her own vow to take care of both of them when they got old and forgot how to play piano or dance. The laughter that followed sealed their commitment more effectively than any legal document could have managed. Their honeymoon was a long weekend in Wisconsin, camping with Lily at a state park where they could hike during the day, and Carter could play guitar around the campfire at night. Izzy taught Lily simple dance moves while Carter provided musical accompaniment, their evening entertainment becoming a family tradition that would continue for years to come. It wasn't exotic or expensive, but it was perfectly suited to who they had become. People who found joy in simple pleasures, who had learned to value connection over status, who understood that the best stories often emerge from the rubble of our worst disasters. The epilogue to their story came 2 years later when Harrison Rothschild attended one of their public performances at the community center. He came alone, sitting in the back row where he thought he might not be noticed, watching his daughter dance with the man he had tried to destroy. When the performance ended and the audience dispersed, he approached them hesitantly, his earlier arrogance replaced by something that might have been humility. The conversation that followed was awkward and incomplete, but it was a beginning, not of reconciliation, which would take much longer, but of recognition that love takes many forms and doesn't always follow the patterns that parents plan for their children. Carter's music and Izzy's dancing had taught them both that healing is not about returning to who you were before trauma struck. Instead, it's about discovering who you can become when you stop trying to hide your scars and start using them as part of your strength. Their love story wasn't the fairy tale that ends with a kiss and a promise of happiness ever after. It was something more complex and more beautiful, the story of two people who learned that the most profound connections often grow from shared vulnerability, that the songs that break our pride can also be the ones that teach us how to dance.